Welcome to our regular iSpring webinar series where we discuss e-learning trends, share tips and tricks, and highlight client success story. My name is Kate. I'm a community manager at iSpring, and I'm your moderator for today's session. And let me introduce you to my colleague and passionate e-learning consultant at iSpring Solutions, Ina Solar. So Ina will introduce you to our company and we'll be glad to answer all your questions about iSpring. Webinar today is how to create brain-friendly learning experiences, and our presenter will share lots of insights on how to create brain-friendly training that focuses on skill building instead of mere knowledge transfer. And at this point, let me introduce you to your presenter for the day, Matt Gjertsen. Matt have spent the last 15 years teaching people to do everything from fly planes to build rockets. So he currently runs the learning and development consultancy, Better Everyday Studios. And please welcome Matt. Hi, Matt. How are you doing today?
Sorry about that. I'm doing fantastic. I'm great. So excited to be here. I had myself on mute. I know I'm not going to be able to be on mute for the rest of the time, but just for all the participants, so you know, my neighbors decided to cut down a tree today. So hopefully not too much of that is coming through the sound, but just to make everybody aware that that's what's going on.
Yeah, that's okay. It's totally fine. And yeah, I also can't wait to get started. But before we start, let's quickly go over some housekeeping details. And now I pass the mic over to Ina for a quick introduction to our company.
Thank you. I apologize for being so quick. So Matt, especially thank you for letting us know that you have some kind of a nose, because my neighbors started repairing right now. So yeah, we're going to have nosy webinar today. Okay, so guys, for those who aren't familiar with iSpring Solutions, here's just a quick word about our company. For over 23 years, we've been at the forefront of e-learning software design, paving the way to success for individuals, teams, academic institutions, and businesses through enhanced online training and professional development. So 60,000 customers from over 170 countries choose iSpring for our ease of use and award-winning technical support. By the way, we are in top 4 according to Forbes. You can check this out as well. And there are more than 200 iSpring clients referred to a list of Fortune 500, as well as government agencies and educational institutions worldwide, including Microsoft, SAP, Boeing, Adidas, PepsiCo, Volkswagen, MIT, Harvard University, and more. So our flagship product, iSpring Suite, empowers you to create captivating, engaging courses with video lectures, different assignments, and interactive elements and dialogue simulations as well. With iSpring Suite, you can effortlessly transform your existing standard PowerPoint into dynamic e-learning modules, while also converting Word and PDF documents into professional-grade ebooks. Typically, iSpring helps you transform your presentations into a dynamic e-learning course and convert these files to specific format for LMS, so you can collect learning analytics and measure effective learning programs with detailed reports. You also can improve learners' behavioral skills and corporate culture with digestible and engaging compliance or other courses. You will foster effective communication skills through scenario-based conversations with role plays, and build amazing quizzes with 16 types of them, such as branching, hotspot, flexible scoring, instant feedback, and more. And of course, you will be able to keep employees or potential clients maybe competent and compliant in their workplaces, and by achieving 100% on certain courses, as you're going to deliver digestible content and very understandable. You can seamlessly record webcam video or screencasts and create professional voiceovers with instantly translate courses in 52 languages. And yeah, by the way, for HR L&Ds, you can develop top talents with proper organized training as well. So, and if you haven't tried all the advantages of iSpring Suite yet, you are very welcome to do that. I'll just drop a quick message in the chat and you will find the link to download the free trial version in the left bottom corner of your screen. So now that we've gained insights into the incredible features of iSpring Suite, let's dive deeper into practical experiences and learn more about how professionals are incorporating iSpring Suite into Oh, there is a motorbike behind. Yeah. So we've fortunate to have Matt with us today. Thank you so much, who has hands-on experience with iSpring. Matt, so happy to have you here. How are you doing?
Doing absolutely fantastic. I'm also, I know we're going to get into this later, but I can second all the great things about iSpring. So I know we're going to get into that in a little at some point.
Sure, yeah. So could you be kind and share with our audience how long you've been using iSpring Suite and the specific purpose of the project where you found it practically impactful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started using iSpring probably 6 years ago, and to be very specific, I'm talking about the authoring tool part of it, so the plug-in to PowerPoint, and that was the thing that I really loved about it. I was working at SpaceX at the time, and I was the head of L&D there, and my team was responsible for a lot of technical training. We were answering to the entire company. And the challenge that we always had when working with subject matter experts using other authoring tools like Captivate or Storyline is that once you got the content into the authoring tool, it became next to impossible to have a back and forth with the subject matter experts because everything was locked inside the system. So you could export it into like a Word doc or something and have them give comments, but it was never quite the same. And so by what iSpring allowed us to do is the source content was still always the PowerPoint file, right? And we could send that back and forth and the subject matter experts would be able to see it exactly how it was going to appear in the final course, essentially. And you can even, you could even build the online, build the e-learning and then have them make edits to the PowerPoint. And as long as the edits weren't too large, you could pretty seamlessly merge them back together. So it just created, for anybody that is working in those kinds of situations where you're having to create a lot of content and having to create a lot of content where you're relying on a lot of subject matter experts to do a lot of the heavy lifting for that initial content creation, I highly recommend looking into the tool because it saved us so much time and made it so much easier to work with them.
Cool, amazing, fantastic insights. So it's always valuable to hear about real-world applications because from salespeople, it it doesn't sound very true, let's say. So now let's get a bit personal. So Matt, what's your favorite thing about our tool?
It really is what I said of just that ability to keep. The number one thing is it keeps the source content in a file form that everyone can access. That's the number one thing for me.
Okay, cool. Anything else maybe you would like to add?
I think that's about, that's the biggest thing for me.
Okay, great, awesome. Anyway, I'm happy to hear that it's very user-friendly from tech part especially. So, and it had such a positive impact on your work, save your time, right, and simplify your job. And finally, let's get to the heart of the matter. Let's say, how can you create brain-friendly experiences with iSpring Suite?
That's, a big part of what we're going to kind of go through today. I think the thing about this content, or what we're going to talk about today, it's not necessarily anything revolutionary. It's just a different way to look at the things that probably a lot of the people on here already know. It's kind of a reminder of best practices. And so like the first rule that as we get into this, the first rule that I'm going to bring up is getting specific. And I think that's one thing that you can really do with a rapid e-learning authoring tool like iSpring, is it allows you the possibility to get extremely specific with what you are trying to get across with this one e-learning module. And so if anything, I would say the content that I'm going to walk you through, the process that I'm going to walk everybody through today, is something that if you're working with a lot of subject matter experts, this is the roadmap to teach them so that they are better at authoring those initial versions of the content, so that it comes to you in a solid form, and it's easier to turn into something.
Cool, great, amazing. So I do appreciate your feedback, and let's then continue to our main topic and uncover more strategic insights for creating brain-friendly learning experience. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll pick it up then, and I'll be going for the next little bit that we're here. Please feel free to drop any questions as they come up in the chat. I might not get to all of them since there are quite a few people on the line today. You know, if it runs by pretty quickly, but please feel free to drop questions in as we go. My name is Matt Gjertsen, as you already know. So I'm the founder of a company called Better Everyday Studios, where we help companies make more impactful learning and development programs, training programs for their employees, things that are really behavior focused, things that are going to kind of drive the needle on business results. As you already learned, you know, I kind of started in the corporate space, being inside of SpaceX. But before that, I was an instructor pilot in the U.S. Air Force. So everything, you know, the way I think about training and development and the way I think about creating learning experiences comes from a very practical perspective, right? When I was teaching people how to fly planes, I'm literally teaching them how to not fly into the ground, right? And so it comes back to very practical experiences. So when I got into corporate L&D, I became very focused or interested in what is learning from a practical perspective. All learning is happening in the brain, and I really wanted to understand that. And I think in the last year, something that we're going to focus a lot on at the beginning of this is kind of the link between learning for humans and learning for artificial intelligence. I've gotten a lot of opportunities to kind of compare these two things. And it's actually the reason why I'm most interested in artificial intelligence right now, because I think by looking at it, you can really highlight both the similarities and differences of what is happening for how AI learns and how human beings learn. So before we go any farther, I did want to throw out, I know we have a poll question that we can put up. That's just, since we have a lot of people on, I wanted to quickly ask everybody what role you have in L&D. And Kate, is that okay? Perfect. So that's going to come up. So I know there's 1,000 different ways to slice and dice learning and development, but I think from a big picture perspective, these were kind of the best buckets that I could come up with, right? We have people who are specific instructional designers, people who are specific facilitators, people who are sometimes called learning partners, or you're a training manager or something like that. That's a little bit bigger picture. And then of course, there's tons of people out there who are just, they're doing everything. They're the one training person in their entire company, and they just kind of, they do a little bit of ID, they do a little bit of facilitation, they try to do some strategy when they have time. I thought it'd be great to just kind of get a quick sense of who we have here. Okay, so we got a pretty broad spectrum, but clearly the weight is on the instructional design piece. That's great. And like I said at the beginning, I don't necessarily think you're gonna learn, it's not like the things we're going to talk about today are mind shattering from a strategy or a design perspective. There might be some interesting facts in here, but really what this is designed to do is to remind you of some of those things that when it comes to designing learning experiences, we all know are best practices, but sometimes we just forget them, right? And often I think that's what learning is very often, is it's not necessarily about learning something new. It's about reminding yourself of the things that you already know, but just kind of forget to do or forget to implement. So that's what we're going to see here today. When we get really specific about like I mentioned, this connection between learning and AI. One fact that I learned that's really interesting that I learned recently about just how far AI has to go is the fact that the human brain, for all of the amazing things that it does and all of the things that we're trying to reproduce in computers, the human brain runs on about 20 watts of power, which is the amount of power that is often used by a small incandescent light bulb, right? So it's not a lot of power. And when you compare that to the amount of energy that is used by something like ChatGPT, the models that are underpinning ChatGPT run on about 10 million watts of power, right? So 20 watts of power to 10 million watts of power. That's a 5-order magnitude difference in the efficiency of our brains. When you listen to people like Elon Musk talk about AI, this is the thing that he focuses on as the big ways we can advance. Because clearly, our brains are doing, though for specific tasks, the outcomes might be pretty similar. Clearly, our brains are getting to that outcome from a very different path. And one great example of that is in chess. Again, apologies for all the noise outside right now. So it's been a long time since computers started to beat humans and even the best humans, right? So now computers always are beating the best humans. But it's interesting how those computers beat the best humans, in that if you go back to Deep Blue from a decade or so ago and some of those first matches with Garry Kasparov and all that, the way that the computers were reaching their conclusions were that they would basically, every single move, they would do like millions of different permutations of how this game could unfold, right? So they were very much brute forcing their way to a solution by just using the sheer amount of computing power that they had. And that's very much what a lot of AI does today. They do it in similar ways, where there's just a lot of probabilities that are running. And though we don't know precisely, like certainly I don't, and I don't think any researcher could truly give you the answer of why our brains are so much more efficient than modern AI. But I think this is one of the reasons, is the fact that most AI systems are kind of brute forcing, imagining every possible outcome versus some other path. And that other path that our brains use is something that neuroscientist Anil Seth calls hallucinating your reality. And I think this is a TED Talk that I highly recommend everybody go watch, because if you've never seen it, it's going to kind of blow your mind. And the fact is that when you are looking out into the world, let's just take vision for an example, right? When you're looking out into the world, you think you're perceiving, the things that you're perceiving as the world are based on the photons that are hitting your eyes. But in reality, the photons that are hitting your eyes are making up a very small percentage of what you're perceiving as reality, because that's really energy intensive. If in real time your brain was having to process these photons and then use that to create reality, it would take a whole ton of processing power. Instead, what it does is it uses just about 10% of the visual information coming into your eyes and makes up the rest of it using your past experiences, the things that you've seen before. It's always predicting what you think will be there. And that's why, many of you have probably had an experience like this. One day I was driving to work, sitting in the left-hand turn lane, right? So I'm turning across the intersection, light turns green, I start to turn, and halfway through the turn, a 10-year-old kid appeared in the crosswalk in front of me. Like, to me, he just kind of appeared there. And the reason why that happened is because my brain was just predicting what was supposed to be there. And it wasn't until kind of like enough differences arose in the world around me that it suddenly brought to my attention, hey, this isn't normal. This isn't what you normally see. There's a kid in the middle of the road, right? And so by understanding, I think this is the root of how I think about creating brain-friendly learning experiences, is realizing that most of what our brains are doing is predicting the future and coming up with like the optimal path for you to get to a better future for yourself. Right? That's really what's happening. And so as we get into the specifics of what this means, of how do you create brain-friendly learning experiences, I think it really comes down to these 3 steps of number 1, getting specific, number 2, giving context, and number 3, building connections. And so we'll go through each of these to talk about what I mean here. So to start with number 1, getting specific, this is essentially really important because of the sheer amount of information coming into our brains and how much filtering our brains have to do in order for us to basically be able to exist in the world. Your brain is processing approximately 11 bits of information, 11 billion bits of information per second. Right? 11 billion bits of information. That's all the information that's flooding into your brain from, your fingers, your stomach, just like all your senses. All of this information is flooding into your brain. And like I said before, you simply do not have the processing capability to like actively think about and handle all of that information. That's why so much of this happens at an unconscious level, right? Your breathing, all of your body regulation, most of your initial reactions to things are all based on unconscious behavior. So remember, your brain is processing approximately 11 billion bits of information a second. Your conscious attention can only focus on about 40 to 50 bits of information per second. So your brain is constantly having to, given that 11 billion bits of information, what are the most important 40 to 50 bits of information? Right? And so there's a couple different systems in your brain. 2 of the big ones are your reticular activating system and your amygdala, are parts of the brain that are largely around trying to figure out, of that 11 billion bits, what's the most important? What can affect me? Remember, your brain is, just like everything in your body, is there to help you survive. And so it's constantly trying to figure out what are the most important things of information that are going to help me survive, that matter to me. A great example of this, right, is like for those of you who commute into work, if I asked you how many cars you passed on your way to work today, you would probably have no idea. But if I asked you, so like for me, like I drive a Tesla. And so now that once I bought a Tesla, I would see them everywhere, right? Because all of a sudden, like it mattered more to me. That particular piece of information, that particular kind of car was more important to me. And so I would notice it. And so that's what's going on, is your brain is constantly going out there and trying to figure out what's the most important thing to me. So in training, that's really what we have to start at. That's what I mean by getting specific. It's that you need to have a point, and you need to get, you have a point that matters to people, and you need to get to that point as fast as possible. And the narrower you can make that point, the better. I always go back to thinking about, I used to swim in college, and sports is really, really good at getting specific, right? In sports, when I was in swimming, we would spend a half hour practicing flip turns, and that's it, right? We would just do flip turn after flip turn after flip turn, because that was the one process, the one thing we were trying to work on. And by narrowing down, it became much easier for our brains to focus on just that one thing. Now, if you contrast this with, the kinds of things that we often see in our world, right, in the corporate development world, right, we have a course on leadership, right, which you can't get much broader than that, right? Like, of course, it's going to be difficult for anybody to have substantial takeaways because the course is on leadership. It's simply too broad, and people kind of, not only is there too much to focus on, but there's no specific reason given often as to why this is so important to you, and so you can narrow that down to, okay, I'm going to have a course on giving feedback. But giving feedback is also pretty broad. Like, there's different models, there's different moments. But if you have a training session that is specifically devoted to the idea of giving real-time feedback using the situation behavior impact model, Now that's a very narrow ask of what you are trying to get people to achieve. And it can all, and by narrowing down the ask of what you're trying to achieve, you can narrow down the reason for why it's important, right? In this particular case, you can say, you know, you're having difficulty giving feedback to your people because you're waiting too long. You know, those difficult conversations, you're, you know, storing up all that information for a week or a month and then kind of dumping it on them in a conversation. And so it's creating all of this anxiety for you. And so if you can do this, you can get rid of all that anxiety because you're just giving them more real-time feedback, right? And so the way I always get to this, and this is something, again, going back to working with subject matter experts, because I think the first challenge to this is that when you're working with subject matter experts, they want to show their expertise, right? So they want to dump all the information out there. And so I would sit down with that subject matter expert and watch them fill an entire, you know, whiteboard with all of the great stuff that they want to put in this course. They'd drop their, you know, 500 slide decks and say, this is going to be a tremendous course. I'm going to give people, you know, an engineering degree in one fell swoop. But in reality, I would just come back with this one question of, what behavior are you trying to change? And that's it. Right. And so depending on how long you have with a particular engagement, with a particular training, maybe you can try to handle more things, more behaviors. But especially if you're trying to do like micro learning or just like a 30-minute or a 1 hour kind of session, isolating it down to one behavior is really, really important. So that's the first thing that you need to do. You could call this kind of like the science of attention, right? And it's realizing that the brain is processing a lot of information. And so the narrower you can get, the better, because you want to highlight to the brain, this is the important thing. And that is where the brain is going to be happy. So after step 1, we move on to step 2. And step 2 is giving context. And I like to think about giving context as creating a bridge from the new thing that people are learning back to all of the things that they used to do. If anybody has read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear has his 4 stages of habit formation, and it all starts with a cue. The cue is the context. And so when we tie this back to the behavior, right, that we were just talking about, what's the thing in a person's life, in a person's regular day-to-day work, that's going to remind them, oh, this is the new thing. This is how I want to implement this new behavior, right? I think we have another poll here that I just kind of wanted to ask everybody. Again, these are very broad buckets of things, but I wanted to ask the question of, what type of training do you focus on? Just so we can maybe we can connect some of these things to what we're talking about here. Again, I know there's a bunch of stuff here, but you know, if you go really high level, there's like leader and manager development, employee soft skill development, and then job skill development. It looks like a ton of people here are on the job skill side, which is great, because I think, like I said, in my experience, that's where, you know, tools like iSpring can be really super effective. But I think, you know, so when it comes to thinking about context, it's thinking about what are the situations like where they're going to be implementing this behavior, right? Is there a particular system that they're commonly using? Is there language that they're commonly using? Is there a time of day that they're commonly using? I think a lot of times one of the mistakes we make is in order to do training, we take people out of their regular job environment and put them in a learning environment, right? Teach them a bunch of stuff, and then we put them back into their work environment and wonder why they don't remember anything. And a lot of it has to do with context, right? Our brains are designed to remember things contextually. And so by switching that context, it's, of course, people aren't going to really be able to remember what you're trying to teach them. Some examples of this, might be something as simple as using realistic language in your training. Like, this is one of the reasons why I really struggle with off-the-shelf training. And the reason why Better Everyday Studios, we focus on making custom training for organizations, because something as simple as, a training on goal setting, let's say, and your organization uses OKRs, but the training just talks about like goals in general, right? Something as simple as those little language differences. So there could be language is one way that you can build in context. I think another great example of context is the timeliness of a lot of training, right? By delivering training right before a feedback cycle, so it's in context temporally, right? That's a great way to remind people versus, a perfect example that often happens in onboarding is we do onboarding and we explain, a bunch of situations, all the things that somebody needs to know about long before they're ever going to apply that knowledge. Or something like manager training. You explain to managers when they first become a manager, this is how you approve leave, but maybe it's several months before they actually ever need to approve leave in a system. Or this is how you use our review system, but it's 6 months until the review process actually kicks off. And so trying to deliver training that is contextually in the language that you're using, is contextual in the timeliness of the training, and then just as many other situations as you can think of, right? And so, after asking the question, what behavior are you trying to change? The next question is, what context do you need to include to remind people of this? Should you be talking about the specific signs that are up in the workplace, whatever it is, right? So there's any number of examples of the context that you want to build in, but there's a lot of things that you can think about to create that context for folks. So those are the first two steps, right? You have to start by figuring out what is that new behavior that you're trying to train. And then with context, how are you going to remind people of that behavior? So what's the bridge between their current behavior and this new behavior? And then once that kind of neural pathway is laid down, ultimately, all of this comes back to changing neural pathways, right? That's what learning really is about. You need to reinforce those new connections that you've built in the brain. And ultimately, this comes down to this idea that many of you have probably heard, is that neurons that fire together wire together. And what this phrase is talking about is kind of two different things that come back to this idea that our brains are really, really efficient at all this processing. So number one, directly to this quote, the idea that neurons that fire together wire together, the connections in between neurons in the brain, these are called synapses, and your brain has trillions of them. And the more often those synapses fire, the stronger those connections get, which means it's easier and easier for those neurons to fire in sequence, right? And so that's the first thing that you get from this. And then the second thing is when you look at the individual neurons, that repetition, the repeated use of a neuron builds up a substance called myelin along the outside of that neuron, which again makes it easier and faster for that individual neuron to fire. So what we're trying to do, since changing behavior is all about changing the brain. The first step identified this new neural path. The second step created a bridge from the old neural paths to this new neural path. So now you have this whole new neural connection in the brain. And now we need to reinforce that connection and make it as strong as possible. And there's a number of different ways that you can do this, but I think two of them, the two biggest ones, are repetition, something that we all see, and emotion, right? Again, in the sports world, repetition is huge, right? You identify a very specific movement, and then you do it again and again and again. In a few years ago, I got really into personal development, so I went to things like a Tony Robbins seminar, and there's a situation where they're trying to make massive behavioral changes in people in a very short amount of time. And so in order to strengthen those connections as much as possible, he and his team create as much emotional energy as you can possibly imagine in an experience, right? Like you're literally walking on fire at his events. It's totally crazy. But that's because, obviously the repetition makes sense. If you think about evolutionary, how the brain is working, if you do a movement or a thought or whatever again and again and again, the brain's probably going to say, oh, this is an important thing. So I want to be able to do this thing. I want to be able to do this action as efficiently as possible. And so that's why it's going to strengthen the neural connections and it's going to myelinate the individual neurons so that that one thing is super easy. On the emotional side, it also makes sense evolutionarily because, before we had phones, before we had social media and all this, these situations where emotional events were very personal, if you go back in time, hundreds of thousands of years, emotional events were probably going to be life and death events, right? They're emotionally shocking because you almost died or you ran out of food or you got kicked out of the tribe or whatever it is. So again, the brain was rewarded to say, let's remember these kinds of things. So if you can build emotion into your training, that's another way to strengthen these neural connections a little bit faster. What are some very specific examples of this? Or if we think about repetition, probably anybody that's facilitated live training has done situations where, using breakout sessions to practice a particular feedback model. You put people into groups, you get them to practice one round, you then come back and debrief, and then you go back and do another one. You can do that again and again. In the context of e-learning, you can use that same kind of thing where maybe you sprinkle quizzes throughout a course instead of just at the very end, right? So you tell people some information, you ask them questions about it, then you kind of go back and back around and around so that you give people more and more repetitions of remembering, oh yes, this is important. Oh yes, this is important. I'm going to remember this. From an emotional perspective, similarly, the example that you have up on the screen of debriefing with a coach after difficult feedback. So let's say you're trying to teach someone and build connections around this idea of a new way to give feedback. You let somebody go have a difficult conversation. That's an emotionally charged event. And then immediately after, have them meet with a coach to talk about how that conversation went. It's really going to allow some of that emotional element to stay in the brain and help that information sink in. In the case of whether it's facilitation or e-learning, games and competitions are a great way to build in this emotional element, right? Where you want people to get excited, really have some stuff to, we are very competitive creatures naturally. And so I'm always amazed at how quickly that can, just by dividing people into two groups and, putting up a Jeopardy board or something like that. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. How quickly that competitive element will kind of fuel things and push this stuff forward. So that and again, there's many ways that you can do that, both in e-learning and with facilitation. To get at this, I think the question is, so how can I reinforce the behavior from step one? Again, you go back to this idea of we get a really specific behavior, an outcome that we're trying to achieve. How can we reinforce this? And you can see, again, going back to this idea that none of this is, groundbreakingly new in any way, for sure. These are all really coming back to just pretty, the best practices for instructional design from the very beginning. And so if you think about context and if you think about building connections, it can be kind of hard when you don't know what your point is. And I think that's where most of us any of you who have been in instructional design for a while, that it really is about that kind of like backwards design almost, of figuring out what's the end state that you're trying to achieve and then work your way back from that. And so by starting with this idea of let's get really specific of what is this behavior that we're trying to change. And I'm noticing in the comments, people are coming from different places. So if you're in an academic environment, maybe the behavior that you're trying to change really just is, I need people to remember this fact. That's okay. If you're just trying to transfer knowledge to folks, that can be a valuable behavior, because the point is to, get past this test or move on, understand this block of knowledge. For those of us out in the corporate world, I think very often we need to get a little bit farther than that and say, like, why is this knowledge important? What's the end behavior that we're trying to change? I think, many of us have probably heard of the Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of analysis. That's why if you haven't, the 4 levels of analysis start with, okay, so level 1, when you're evaluating a course and try to determine how good that course is. Level 1 is you're just evaluating kind of the experience, right? And this is where you get those smile sheets of, was the room too warm? How engaging was the facilitator? That kind of thing. So level 1 is the experience. Level 2 is the knowledge gained by the participants. So this is where you can have tests and quizzes. Level 3 is where you're judging the behavioral change from the course. And level 4 is what's the impact of this course. Usually it's the impact on the business. Are we making more money? Are we making fewer errors? That kind of thing. And so I always love to think about that as a design tool done in reverse, where you start with what's the impact we're trying to achieve, then go back to, okay, what's the behavior we need in order to achieve that outcome, achieve that impact? What's the knowledge we need to get to that behavior? And then what's the experience we need to create in order to transfer that knowledge and practice that behavior? And so that's how I come back to this, right? You need to start with identifying what is that specific behavior that you're trying to change. Okay, great. What is the context in which this behavior is going to be happening, and how can we build that into our learning experience? And then finally, okay, now that we have this learning experience where we know the situation, we have the context, we have the behavior, what can we do to make that as memorable as possible? And you're doing that either through some kind of repetitive exercise where you're asking quizzes again and again, you're doing lots of practice in the facilitated session, you're having people show you out on the job floor multiple times what they're trying to do. So you can do that through that repetition. Or to kind of fast track that a little bit is to build in some kind of emotional element to it all, where you're getting people a little bit more excited about this learning in order to reinforce it a little bit more. And I think that's why, these days, things like gamification, having fun, that's an emotion, right? We want things to be fun and active because we're raising the emotional level of it. And again, going back to where we started with the fact that our brains are meant to be highly, they're really efficient at figuring out what to focus on, or they have to be good at figuring out what to focus on in order to be so efficient. Emotion tells you, hey, this is important. This is something that you're going to want to remember. So the more you can bring emotion into this, the better. And so those are the three basic steps to all of this, right? Where we want to get really specific of what we're trying to achieve. We then, what's the behavior we're trying to change? We think about the context in which that behavior is going to happen and make sure the training or the learning that we're doing is building in that context. And then finally, what exercises, what things do we want to do to realize that ultimately what we're trying to do is to change the brain, and changing the connections in the brain for the long term is going to require some fair amount of repetition or emotional elements to do it. So that's how I think of when it comes to creating brain-friendly learning experiences. This is what you want to do. I'm going to open it up. I know there have been some questions in here quite a bit. I would love to have, see if anybody has some more specific ones, or Kate, if you highlighted any that you want us to chat about. Before I open up to that, I will say, so like I said, Better Everyday Studios, we help organizations create training that is much more impact focused. And if you use this QR code, it's going to take you to a form that will allow you to download something that we just came up with last year called the Talent Launch System. And it's using it's borrowing heavily from a metaphor that I created given my space background and background in the launch business. And really what this is that if you're a part of or running any learning development programs in organizations, this gives you a slightly different lens to think about, okay, if I really want to focus on how are we going to focus on the business, these are the kinds of learning programs that are going to, as quickly as possible, produce an ROI for the business. So if you're interested, you can have it for free. I'd love to, for any of you to reach out to me. Also, just to say, please reach out to me on LinkedIn if anybody is, if I'm very active on LinkedIn, so I'd love to continue this conversation. So if you don't ask your question now, or I don't get to it, then please make sure to throw it my way. I'll put, in case the QR code doesn't work, I think I have, here's the link to download the Talent Launch System as well. And so with that, I'll throw up some questions. Pete, I saw you've asked a couple times, are you hiring? Unfortunately, I'm not hiring right now. I do know a lot of instructional designers out there who happen to be looking for work, unfortunately. But I am not hiring right now on our team. So let's see. And
And
Jen,
there, yeah, also a
go
question
for
from
it.
Jen. Where
Where else can you reach out to me? Matt at bettereverydaystudios.com. That's directly to me. Please do shoot me a note. Matt, here, I'll even type it in. Matt at bettereverydaystudios.com. Make sure I got that right. Yep, there you go.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for sharing all this practical information, all these handouts. That was great. And before we start the Q&A session, I want to ask all our participants who can't stay longer to fill out the survey about the webinar. I'll share a link in the chat. Just a few minutes of your time. And yeah, so let's see, we have some questions. I thought we had some in the beginning, like one clarification question from Jason. The 11 billion of bits of processing, is it per second?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we double checked.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. And
Yeah.
Robin is asking which learning theories are being utilized here. Like, can you refer to some theories? I don't know.
So a lot of this is coming. I'm getting a lot of this is kind of like a compilation of a bunch of reading I did last year. So this is coming from a lot of work done by a researcher named Anders Ericsson, who talks a lot about what's the specific phrase? The specific name is deliberate practice. He has this model called deliberate practice that is different from the kind of practice that most people do, which is called naive practice. So I highly recommend people look up Anders Ericsson. It also pulls a lot from an author, another neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett. She has a book called How Emotions Are Made. Totally changed my perspective of kind of how the brain works. And she has a new book that I think is called 7.5 Facts About the Brain. I haven't read it yet, but I'm really excited to read it. So a lot of this is kind of coming from like those are the two that I always think about. I read a bunch of other books kind of around those two, but those were two of the central pillars of where a lot of this information came from.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a big question from Zay. What about for the train the trainer session? Is there a specific example that you can share and how you'd enhance their learning experience virtually or face-to-face, considering that almost all of the participants are really busy with their own train sessions too?
Yeah, I think this is a big one, and I actually I love doing train the trainer sessions with non-trainers as well, because like at some point everybody's going to teach something in their company, and so I think the more people you can have who kind of know about this stuff, the better. I'll ask a question to you that you can answer kind of as I'm going. Is when you say train the trainer, who are your trainers? Like, because train the trainer can take a couple different ways of like, are you talking about facilitation? Are you talking about learning design? Because when I see this question, the first thing that I think of is more on the learning design side. And that's where I lean really heavily into that first question of what behavior you're trying to change and try to get, because I think a lot of trainers and a lot of and I guess this applies to facilitation as well, because so many of us have experienced a lot of formal education. When we hear training, when we hear learning, we default back to formal education, which for better or worse can often be heavily lecture based, sage on the stage based, right? Or you think of TED Talks, right? And so I think a lot of people can consciously or unconsciously or not default into, I'm training, I'm the facilitator, I'm here to share information. And so by really focusing on that idea of like, no, your goal is to change behavior, your goal is to try to have an impact. The kind of exercises that I like to run with people is just to get that repetition, is to do a series of, here's a behavior that you're trying to change. What would you, or here's a big picture idea, something like leadership training. What's an example of a behavior here, and have them do, kind of group sessions where they can brainstorm, okay, what is a specific, how specific can we get with this behavior? It's honestly something that I do with this kind of with this session, when I do it in a longer time frame, when we can do breakouts, is that when I ask that question earlier in the presentation, we do a 5-minute breakout where everybody goes out into their respective groups and tries to say like, okay, this is a presentation, or this is a behavior that we're going to try to change, to help them practice getting more specific. And so to that point of, how do you manage or enhance the learning experience? I think that's what I always come back to, is how do you help people practice that one skill of identifying a specific behavior? Because it's something that I think a lot of us are pretty bad at until we practice it. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, thank you for that's full answer. And yeah, we also have a question from Carlotta. Building scenarios into the training, would that be considered reinforcement by emotion?
I 100% think so. Absolutely. And I think, yeah, because, and I think especially if they are contextually relevant scenarios, right? If there's something that everybody can relate to, I 100% think that can be emotion. If you're building them well, if you're telling a good story, then I 100% think that can be emotional reinforcement through emotion, 100%. And then it also has the element of repetition, because you can build multiple scenarios.
Yeah, true. And we also have a question about emotions. Um, Question from Grant. I like to be creative in courses. I suppose one can get too engaging in an online course, but you talked about getting emotional as a way to remember it. Do you have examples of good courses you've created, Matt?
From an online perspective, so I think there's a couple different ways to do this. I think building emotion. So one thing, just from the online element, I just try to be my main design factor is just trying to be as brief as possible, right? Like really getting specific on what we're trying to do and only focusing on that, trying to put myself in the shoes of the learner and, care about their time at the utmost. And so getting really specific. And so that's often what I think of when I think of the best courses that I've created, is from that brevity piece, of trying to keep things as streamlined as possible. From that emotional side, I think some of the best courses, like I've done stuff around DEI, and typically in online courses, when we're talking about the emotional piece, I think it's a lot of reflection, of doing really great work, to craft a scenario or a question that gets people thinking honestly about their past, and can potentially like surprise them a little bit. I think that's typically what I think of when I think of a good way to build emotion into an online course, is through prompting those times of self-reflection. Obviously, sometimes it's not going to work because people can just click next sometimes. But that's what I always try to come back to.
Thank you for sharing your experience. And there is another question about your experience. So, a question from Clint. Can you give one example of how you created connections in a classroom environment?
Yes. And so speaking from connections from this point of view, I'm just a huge fan of breakout sessions and repetitive breakout sessions, and often breakouts or sessions that kind of build on one another. So for example, I did a sales training where this was orientation for sales. The first thing that we wanted to do is it was for a sales team selling a relatively complex product. And so the number one thing we wanted to do is to get them to have a whole understanding of the product that they could explain very simply and quickly, develop their elevator pitch, if you will. And so we started with the normal, hey, let's just do this knowledge dump, right? Where we just presented the information about the product, 15, 20 minutes, just walk people through it. And then we put everybody into breakout groups and said, okay, come up with a 300-word explanation of everything that you just saw, right? So in their own words, give them a chance to write it all out. Come back, do some sharing, talk about it. Okay, great. Now do that again in 100 words. So they had to like really distill it down to just 100 words. Again, still writing it out and then talking about it. Okay, great. You got that. Perfect. Now I'm going to have you call a Google Voice number and leave a message saying your pitch, right? So you actually have to say it verbally. So again, there's that so that's a repetition piece where we're doing it again and again, but we're building that emotional element into this because all of a sudden people are nervous because they're actually on the phone, actually recording their voice. And they know that when we come back, we're going to listen to it as well. And that listening piece to it was actually another repetitive event, right? Because they heard it, it came into their brain and they're really nervous as well because everybody else is listening to it and critiquing it. So it was a high level of emotion and a lot of repetition. And then we did it one more time just so they could repeat it again and kind of apply lessons learned from actually hearing it that first time. So that's always whenever I think of like what are my favorite training experiences that I've created, that's always the one I go back to.
Yeah, I can see comments in the chat. That's really clever. So yeah, thank you.
Just to throw one more piece on it because I really loved this was on Google Voice, right? Because it's free. You can also record like the voicemail message, right? So when somebody calls in, what are they going to hear? And so we actually used it for objection handling as well, where for that little voice thing, instead of saying, hey, you've reached, in the number, I would speak the objection, right? So it's like I'm a potential customer that they're calling and I'm saying, but the product's just like a little too expensive. And then the sales rep would have to leave their message answering that objection. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. I will try to find the most interesting one. Um, again, about behavioral changes. So oftentimes stakeholders are asking for more than one behavior change and expect more
Yes.
than one change focus.
Yes.
And is there a compromise such as a training that focuses on 5 changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the number one challenge that all of us face in that people are just, our stakeholders are often completely unrealistic about what we can expect. And I think this is where it's a relationship building exercise of slowly trying to move the needle and get people to narrow in their focus a little bit. It's not easy. I don't think you can firewall it and just say no, only one behavior, that's it. Right? But it's by developing a relationship with your stakeholders, you can slowly get more and more of an ability for them to trust you, that you know what you're doing. One way to do this is to, by really focusing on what behaviors you're trying to change, hopefully you can measure whether or not that change is happening. So theoretically over time, you can show like, this wasn't super effective because we did it this way. Can we try it this way? Or maybe they let you A/B test. And I think a lot of this has to do with the amount of resources that you're given as well. The more resources that you have, the more time you have, the more behaviors you can try to change. I admit it's not an easy situation, but I think really what it is it's relational building to try to slowly steer that ship.
Okay, thank you. I think that was our last question for today. And just a few things before we say goodbye. So a link to survey will appear right after the webinar ends. And as a reminder, we'll send a link to the recording of today's webinar to all of our participants tomorrow. And if you still have questions, you can also leave them at this Google form, or you can contact Matt. Or if you have questions about iSpring, I will share contacts of my colleague Ina. Yeah, so you can contact her. And lastly, but very importantly, we have another webinar coming up soon. The webinar is called Mastering Interactive Learning, Unlock Learner Engagement with iSpring Interactions. It will be on the 1st of February. And yeah, if you are interested in emotional change and behavioral and something like interactions, how to engage learners, you can register for it now. I will share a link in the chat. And Yes, I think it's all. Matt, thank you for sharing all these
Thank you so much.
insights. Yeah, and thank you everyone for joining us this hour as well. Hope you enjoyed. Bye, take care.
Bye, everybody.
Hope to see you someday again. Bye bye.